Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So we are continuing our series of looks at the stories in From a Certain Point of View, which is the 40th anniversary collection celebrating Return of the Jedi. The story we're talking about today is my favorite of our current series of 4 that we're looking at. It's called No Contingency. It is about Mon Mothma and about the plans that many Bothans died to get the information to the Rebel Alliance. And it turns out that Mon Mothma herself was a part of the chain that brought the plans to the Rebel Alliance. Specifically, she is the person who actually retrieves the information. So she's going out on a mission, which pretty much doesn't really happen in Star Wars storytelling. She's usually back at the base. She usually is sending other people out on missions and whatnot, but she is the final contingency plan basically for this particular situation where chains of groups of intelligence agents have been trying to get this information out. And yes, we know, of course, that this information is tainted and that Palpatine wanted it to fall into the rebellion's hands, but it couldn't look like it was just falling into their hands. It had to look like it was going to be a lot of trouble to get it. And we find out that pretty much every link in the chain passing on this vital information has died. Every group of intelligence agents, whether it was a group of Mon Mothma's people or some other group of people, like they got it passed on, but then they died somehow. And so it finally found its way to the surface of an asteroid, and it is hiding inside a repurposed EX droid. And that's kind of fun because the EX droids figured prominently in the Phase 2 storytelling happening for the High Republic Mega Ginormous Initiative. And as with the story we talked about yesterday, the From a Certain Point of View story that touched upon the events of the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV series, this one also gives a wink and a nod to the Andor series when Mon Mothma reflects upon the fact that she programmed a self-destruct timer into these EX droids and thinks that even Luthen would have considered her paranoid for doing so. Luthen, of course, being Luthen Rael in there. In Mon Mothma's internal monologue, it's only Luthen, it's not Luthen Rael. So the fact that it's just his first name, I guess on the one hand, of course, she's only thinking of him by his first name in her own internal monologue. But as readers, it does kind of feel like, oh, you know, you have to be aware a little bit more. So it feels a little bit more like an insider kind of wink and a nod, basically. So she manages to fly out to this asteroid and she's being flown out there by an RX droid. And that's also another fun little thing that ties into the droids that fly the ships in Star Tours at Disneyland and Walt Disney World. There is a bit of a similarity to the Obi-Wan Kenobi story as well, in the sense that we spend a lot of time inside Mon Mothma's head and not a lot really happens, quote unquote, until suddenly it does. And I don't even want to spoil it for you, basically, because the story has kind of a holy bleep moment where you're like, oh my gosh, you thought that this was just going to be, you know, a quiet, reflective kind of situation, and then suddenly it's not. It requires Mon Mothma to be a bit of an action hero for a minute, and it's done believably, but, you know, even that part is kind of shocking and surprising in its way. So, as we know, the plans do get back to the Rebel Alliance, and she, it turns out, is the one who brings them there. And just before the briefing, we find out that Admiral Akbar basically says to Mon Mothma, like, you're going to stay behind while we go to the Death Star. So if you were wondering whether she was actually at Endor as part of that battle, she was not. She was elsewhere. We don't necessarily know if she was still at Sullust, where the fleet had been massing, or if they sent her somewhere else. Yeah, that we don't necessarily know, but the fact that she was not at Endor, that at least is a new bit of information. I tell you, from Caroline Blackiston just completely transfixing people in Return of the Jedi with just that one brief scene, and then, you know, it was so strong that it formed the basis for bringing that character back, and Genevieve O'Reilly has just done marvelous things with it, and it's impossible not to see her in this role as you're reading this now. And we've been, you know, very, very well blessed to have her show up in the Ahsoka series and then in the Andor series. Like, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff that's been happening with her. And so, yeah, definitely my favorite story of this run of 4 so far. And that's what I've got for you about No Contingency, which is the Mon Mothma story and From a Certain Point of View. That is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.